Late 1944, near Trier, Germany, U.S. navigator. His parachute hastily buried, crouched in a waterlogged ditch. German voices echoed through the woods. The hunt had begun. Then he saw it. A field-gray Kübelwagen, the Wehrmacht's iconic open-topped car, parked outside a farmhouse, its driver, a lieutenant, striding inside. In that heartbeat, the evader's calculus changed. As he later reported, his choices were crawl and be caught, or drive. He sprinted for the vehicle, twisted the ignition, and lurched onto the road. He now possessed the most valuable and dangerous tool imaginable, the enemy's own transport. But his path to the French border and freedom was a gauntlet. Allied intelligence maps warned of at least 12 hardened German checkpoints, contrapunct, blocking the roads west. His plan was a breathtaking bluff, not to go around them, but to drive straight through each one, using the stolen Kübelwagen as his only passport. The cognitive dissonance was profound. The Nazi security state was a machine of procedure, uniforms, and documents. An Allied airman, wearing a torn flight suit under a stolen greatcoat, with no papers and a terrible accent, sitting behind the wheel of their own vehicle, represented a catastrophic short circuit in that machine's logic. It was an attack not on a soldier, but on the system's fundamental assumptions. But how did one man with no disguise and a terrible accent manage to pass through a dozen layers of Nazi security? And what does his unbelievable journey reveal about the psychology of deception in total war? Understand the sheer audacity of this bluff? Gender Mori training manuals and evasion briefings show we must first grasp the formidable, regimented wall of security the Nazis had built. By 1944, the German Reich had turned inward, fortifying itself with a labyrinth of bureaucratic control. Its nervous system was the checkpoint. Manned by the iron-faced Feldgendarmerie Field Police and Zollgrenz's Customs Border Protection. On every major road, at every bridge and town entrance, these choke points enforced a regime of papers. The Wehrpass for identity, the Marschbell for travel orders, the Fahrzeugpapier for the vehicle. For downed Allied airmen, labeled Terrorflieger, these checkpoints were the teeth of the trap. Alerts with physical descriptions were circulated instantly. The penalty for any German soldier failing in his duty, or for any civilian offering aid, was summary execution. The system was designed to be omniscient and unforgiving. For the German sentry, the checkpoint was a stage for the exercise of unquestioned authority. The procedure was the ritual. Demand papers, scrutinize them, wave the compliant through, detain the anomalous. The very concept that an enemy, a hunted man, would not only approach this nexus of control, but would do so willingly, even assertively, in a stolen German vehicle. Lay outside the procedural imagination, it created a critical blind spot. The system was optimized to catch those who hesitated, who looked furtive, who lacked papers. It was less prepared for someone who arrived in the uniform of the system itself, a Wehrmacht vehicle, and who played his part in the ritual with apparent confidence. The checkpoint was a wall, but like any wall, it had a gate. The airman's insane gamble was that he could walk through that gate by pretending he had every right to do so. As the net tightened around the crash site, the airman was doing the opposite of what every evasion manual advised. His own debriefing report reveals he was applying a fundamental principle of magic. The best place to hide is often in plain sight. The airman's predicament was statistically hopeless. He was in uniform, deep inside the German Reich, where every civilian was legally compelled to report him and every road was patrolled. Standard evasion doctrine, a painstaking nocturnal crawl toward a distant border, was a recipe for capture over the hundreds of miles to Switzerland or the advancing Allied front. He needed two impossible things: speed and a legitimate facade. The abandoned Kübelwagen presented a radical, terrifying solution. It offered blistering speed compared to walking, but more importantly, it conferred a psychological disguise. Behind its wheel, at a distance or in motion, he would be perceived as a Wehrmacht soldier, part of the landscape of German military traffic. It was a mobile piece of camouflage, but one that came with a death sentence if the ruse failed. The stakes were absolute. If caught on foot, he would be a prisoner of war. If caught in the act of driving a stolen German military vehicle, he would be treated as a spy and saboteur, subject to summary execution. His choice was between near-certain capture with some hope of survival and a higher-risk gamble that offered a slim chance of freedom but guaranteed a bullet to the head if he faltered. He chose the gamble. The car was a key, but it unlocked a door that led into the lion's den. But stealing the car was the easy part. The real test was in the performance. Miasek psychologists noted that successful evaders shared one trait: the ability to project unwavering confidence. And as he approached the first checkpoint, his survival depended on selling a single, simple lie. The strategy was pure psychological theater, and the airman was its lead actor. Drawn from Miss X evasion training, the blueprint was not to impersonate a high-ranking officer, a role requiring perfect language and knowledge, but to become a marginal, uninteresting cog in the German machine, perhaps a convalescing soldier being moved rearward, or a highway foreign auxiliary with poor German on a vehicle retrieval detail. His costume was the stolen greatcoat or cap from the Kübelwagen, combined with the vehicle itself, the ultimate prop. His script involved minimal, gruff interaction, a half salute, waved or barely glanced, a forged Ausweis from his escape kit or a stolen pass, a grimace of impatience. The psychological innovation was profound. He wasn't trying to fool an alert detective. He was exploiting the crushing boredom and rigid procedural mindset of checkpoint guards. After hours of inspecting legitimate traffic, the guard's mental process was primed for pattern recognition. German vehicle plus uniformed occupant equals wave through. The airman's job was to fit that pattern perfectly and project the boredom of the routine. Any hesitation, any over-explanation would shatter the illusion. As modern doctrine would frame it, he was operating inside the guard's OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, presenting a pre-processed stimulus that triggered a reflexive, permissive response. Confidence was his primary weapon. MISX trainers drilled that anger is more convincing than fear. A tired, irritated soldier wanting to get past a checkpoint was a universal archetype. A terrified fugitive was an anomaly that would snap the system to attention. With the script set, the curtain rose. German radio logs from the region, later reviewed by intelligence, would show no alarm. In the airman's own words, described the heart-stopping, repetitive drama of approaching each wooden barrier. The first checkpoint materialized like a fever dream, a red and white striped barrier, sandbagged machine gun nest, the steely gaze of a Feldgendarme stepping into the road. The airman's senses narrowed. The smell of the damp vehicle canvas, the taste of copper in his mouth, the deafening roar of his own heartbeat. He slowed, downshifted, and came to a stop, his hands visibly tight on the wheel. This was the moment. He met the guard's eyes with a look of weary impatience. A man interrupted on a mundane duty. He didn't speak, merely thrust a folded, soiled map toward the guard, a vague gesture implying it contained his authorization. He might have grunted dringend or offered a terse Heil Hitler. The interaction hung on a razor's edge. The guard's eyes flicked from the map to the unmistakable silhouette of the Kübelwagen. To the airman's face, partially shadowed by a stolen cap, the calculus of routine took over. The vehicle was German. The driver appeared to be in a German coat. He presented the image of authority, however tersely. A second passed. Then a dismissive nod. The barrier lifted. The airman engaged the clutch, forced himself not to gun the engine, and drove through at a deliberate pace. Only when the checkpoint vanished in his mirrors did the tremors start. The first, most perilous trial was over. He had learned the pattern: approach with bored confidence, present the idea of paperwork, exploit the sentry's desire for a quiet shift. But he also knew the terrifying variability ahead. The next guard could be a bored veteran, a fanatical Hitler Youth auxiliary, or a suspicious SS man. The first success only reset the clock for an even more nerve-shredding repetition. One checkpoint down, the pattern was set, but the strain was cumulative. His E&E report details that the real battle was internal: fighting fatigue, the urge to panic, and the mind-numbing repetition of the gamble, each time with higher stakes. The climax came not at the beginning or end, but in the grinding middle, at checkpoint number 7, guarding a vital bridge over the Saar. Here, a seasoned Feldwebel sergeant, immune to boredom, stepped forward. He didn't just glance. He demanded the Fahrzeug Parier and the Marschbell, the specific movement orders the airman did not have. The bluff was on the verge of collapse. The airman, as his report later described, shifted tactics instantly. Feigning the fog of a head wound, He touched his temple and showed his fingers, smeared with real blood from his bailout cuts. He didn't plead, became irritably insistent, his voice rising. Verwundet. Mochi Merzik. Zoom Verbensplats. Wounded. To Merzik for the dressing station. He invoked a fictional unit, his performance walking the fine line between a concussed soldier-esque confusion and an angry man-esque impatience. The sergeant's internal calculus was now critical. Before him was a man in a German vehicle, in a German coat, acting with the irrational aggression of a stressed, possibly wounded comrade. The paperwork was missing, but everything else fit the chaotic norm of late 1944. To detain him meant paperwork, reports, and the risk of embarrassing a legitimate, if surly soldier. To wave him through was the path of least resistance. The sergeant, tired and wary of complication, made his choice. With a scowl and a disgusted wave, he sent the nuisance on his way. The barrier lifted. This was the turning point. Surviving this depth of scrutiny meant the fundamental premise of his disguise was sound. It proved that the bluff, if played with enough audacity, could withstand direct pressure. The emotional and physical cost was immense. Once out of sight, the airman pulled over, his body convulsing with tremors, vomiting from sheer nervous exhaustion. He had stared directly into the mechanism of his own death, and had not blinked. Now, he had to recompose his shattered nerves for Checkpoint 8. After the crisis, the remaining checkpoints blurred into a tense haze, and as he finally crossed into a forested no-man's land, or was met by a resistance guide, German station logs were only just beginning to report a missing vehicle. The hunt was hours behind him. The German system failed because it was slow, compartmentalized, and built on trust in its own uniformity. The stolen Kübelwagen likely wasn't reported missing until its owner returned hours later. The checkpoint guards, having seen dozens of identical vehicles that day, had no reason to log the solitary car or connect it to a theft far behind their position. By the time an alert was issued, the airman was deep into the security grid, his head start measured in hours, not minutes. When the pieces were finally assembled, the missing vehicle, the downed aircraft, the evader's description, the realization sparked fury and confusion. How had one man, with no papers, driven through the heart of their control network? Frenzied, belated orders to increase vigilance were issued, but the psychological damage was done. The fortress had a hole, and an enemy had walked through it. For the Allies, debriefings of such evaders were intelligence windfalls. They provided real-time snapshots of German security postures, morale at checkpoints, and traffic patterns, invaluable data on the eve of the Battle of the Bulge. For the Germans, it was a demoralizing demonstration of their vulnerability during the war's most desperate hour. The airman's own report likely concludes with ditching the vehicle in a wood, completing the final miles on foot or with the aid of a Maquis network, and eventually stumbling into the lines of an advancing American patrol a free man again. His journey was a stark equation. One man's audacity plus one stolen car, multiplied by a dozen moments of nerve, equaled a total defeat of a vast security apparatus. The immediate victory was one man's freedom. But when intelligence officers debriefed him, they weren't just hearing a great story. They were gathering priceless data on the enemy's security posture on the very brink of the Battle of the Bulge. The immediate impact was twofold: tactical intelligence and doctrinal validation. The airman's meticulous debriefing by MISX officers was a windfall. Its first-hand data on checkpoint locations, guard routines, and the general atmosphere of confusion behind German lines was synthesized into intelligence briefings for advancing Allied units and for refining evasion routes for future downed airmen. His journey proved the Siegfried Line's rear was not an impregnable fortress, but a weary, bureaucratic maze. Operationally, his success became a celebrated case study, reinforcing the big bluff tactic within evasion training. It proved that psychological audacity could overcome physical security, a lesson that would resonate through special operations doctrine for decades. On a personal level, after rigorous debriefing, he was granted survivor leave. It's a standard practice for returned evaders, and likely returned to duty, his story becoming a potent legend within his bomb group and the wider evasion community. His escape occurred at a critical strategic moment, as the Allies were grinding their way into Germany itself. His report provided a rare ground-level snapshot of enemy morale and logistics during the fragile lull before the Ardennes offensive, making it not just a tale of survival, but a piece of the larger intelligence mosaic shaping the endgame of the war in Europe. The contrast was stark. The Allies gained a valuable asset and a validated tactic, while the Germans suffered a humiliating security breach that exposed the growing cracks in their defensive facade. Historians of military deception now see this not just as an escape, but as a classic application of a principle that would be formalized decades later. The concept of hiding in the light. This escape holds enduring significance as a masterclass in the psychological dimension of warfare. It perfectly embodies principles later formalized as hiding in plain sight and using the enemy's system against him. Cornerstones of modern special operations infiltration and deception maskirovka. Unlike tunnel digs or clandestine hikes, this story represents the bluff archetype in escape lore, a frontal, psychological assault on security that wins not by stealth, but by sheer audacity and mimicry. It vividly illustrates a critical vulnerability of rigid, totalitarian systems. Their reliance on predictable procedure and hierarchical deference can be exploited by individual initiative and unpredictable boldness. A single man, understanding the system's rules better than its board enforcers, can turn its greatest strength, its uniformity, into a fatal weakness. As historian and author Ben McIntyre notes of such wartime exploits, the greatest weapon in the evader's arsenal was not a forged paper, but a performance of such brazen normality that it became invisible. This lesson transcends World War II, speaking directly to the dynamics of insurgency and asymmetric conflict, where disciplined, conventional forces are continually challenged by adaptable, unpredictable actors. The legacy is a dual testament to the timeless value of nerve and psychological insight in overcoming material disadvantage, and to the inherent fragility of any security apparatus that prioritizes procedure over critical thinking. Proves that in the calculus of war, the human factors of confidence, creativity, and the will to take insane risks can, in a fleeting moment, outweigh divisions of troops and walls of checkpoints. So, what is the ultimate, timeless lesson from this story of a stolen car and a dozen gates of fear? The ultimate lesson is that in conflict, psychological dominance can overcome physical obstacles. This airman proved that perception trumps reality. A man who convincingly performed the role of someone with authority, who moved with the purpose and props of the system itself, could render 12 fortified checkpoints meaningless. The true barrier wasn't the wooden poles or machine guns. It was the fear they were meant to inspire, a fear he overrode with a greater force, audacious confidence. The Germans failed because their rigid imagination could not conceive of the threat. They hunted for fugitives in the shadows, not for a Trojan horse in the form of their own Kübelwagen. It was a catastrophic failure of expectation rooted in their love of order. This story is a testament to the individual human spirit under pressure, the courage to reject conventional wisdom, to conceive an insane plan, and to execute it with the flawless nerve of a master actor. As an ISX training memo later concluded from such cases, the enemy's greatest strength, his love of order and procedure, can, with sufficient nerve, be turned into a weakness. The boldest path is often the safest. This story is filed in a declassified debriefing in a forgotten archive. If you want to discover more unbelievable true stories of courage and cunning that won World War II, subscribe. We navigate the archive so you can follow the escape routes. Next time, we'll dive into an even more mind-bending escape, the wooden horse of Stalag Luft 3. How Allied POs used a gymnastics vaulting horse to hide a tunnel excavation for a year is a masterpiece of misdirection. History proves sometimes the key to breaking out of a prison isn't to dig under the walls, but to calmly walk out the front gate wearing the warden's own hat.